Potstirrer podcast, where politics, religion, and history collide, and it's not always polite. I have lived in Ohio for well over a decade, but I'm originally from Detroit. And when I was growing up back in the 80s and 90s, most of the fathers of my friends and peers worked for the big three automakers: General Motors, Ford, Chrysler. Even those who weren't working for the big three often had jobs connected to the auto industry. My dad was a clinical psychologist, and for a time back in the 90s, he worked for a private healthcare company that had Ford as a client. Manufacturing was huge in the United States in the not-too-distant past. Big industry provided opportunities for many Americans right out of military service or even right out of high school to make a proper living for their families and live a decent middle-class life, especially in the Midwest, where car manufacturing, steel, and other industries were king. Manufacturing was the backbone of America. But those jobs are largely gone, and they are not coming back. I am your host, Jaye Pool. We are past the 2-month mark of the Donald J. Trump administration. Trump's administration has been marred by scandal as he, Paul Ryan, and the GOP have worked hard from day one to tear down the legacy of former President Barack Obama and to remake the United States into their own oligarchic image. Even with the fight in the courts over the travel ban, the Russia hearings, and failure of Trump care, they are still powering through their agenda. America's ideological center is skewed to the right of the rest of the Western world, and meanwhile, many Americans, especially those left of the center, are angry and have been mobilizing. The Women's March, the protests, the calls, letter writing, postcards, the town halls filled with pissed-off voters. Politicians have stopped listening to the American people a long time ago, but now they no longer pretend to care. Ignoring constituents' calls, refusing to listen to voters that show up at their offices, telephone town halls, canceled town halls, spinning the American people voicing their dissatisfaction as their constitutional right as paid protesting, or worse, anti-American, as Michigan GOP Congressman David Trott did to his own constituents. Power, money, lobbyists, before we the people. But it's important to understand how we got to this point, because if we are not honest about how we got here, we can't fix it. Getting real about what happened in November 2016 and well before that might be painful, but it shines a clear path forward. The mainstream media spun the 2016 presidential election as a sure win for Hillary Clinton, but as a student of polling, something didn't sit right with me. States that should not have been so close, like my native state of Michigan, a solid Democratic state in the last several national elections, was within the margin of error in late polling. That made me question a victory for Hillary. Also, many of the die-hard Trump supporters were conditioned not to trust the mainstream media, not to trust schools, not to trust science, not to trust our institutions. Who is running most of the polling? The mainstream media and universities, schools. Why would they give pollsters the time of day? If a subset of voters have a deep distrust of our institutions, and they're leaning in a specific direction, how valid will the results be? No way to prove it, but it's worth asking the question, as polling results are only as accurate as the information feeding them. Okay, so the polls were interpreted wrong. They might not have been accurate either. But why did Hillary lose? The easy answers: Comey and the email scandal, Benghazi, Putin, Russian hackers, Russian oligarchs, sexism, voter suppression, screwing over Bernie voters in the primaries, Trump's appeals to hate and fear, and the list goes on. But at the end of the day, the election was Hillary's to lose. And you don't win an election simply by being the only adult in the room. And stop blaming Bernie voters or liberals that did not vote for Trump but did not vote for Hillary either. A vote for Trump is a vote for Trump. A vote for anyone else is not a vote for Trump. And even though Trump is awful, it does not absolve Hillary from the job of earning people's votes. It's not good enough to just be, not as bad as the other guy. You have to make the case as to why people, even your party's base, should vote for you. You still have to earn your keep. Because some of us still remember.
Choosing pragmatism over principle, the president told an audience of officers at Washington's Fort McNair he has adopted a version of the policy known as don't ask, don't tell.
It is the best way to proceed because it provides a sensible balance between the rights of the individual and the needs of our military to remain the world's #1 fighting force.
They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel.
In a few moments, I will sign the North American Free Trade Act into law. NAFTA will tear down trade barriers between our three nations. It will create the world's largest trade zone and create 200,000 jobs in this country by 1995 alone.
In the early 1990s, the Democratic establishment made a deal with the devil. They kept losing the White House to Ronald Reagan twice and then George Bush the first. And the Republican Party, before they were the party of ideological conservatives, they were the party of big business. The Democratic Party was the party of labor. Most Americans back then defined themselves as Democrats, but many of them voted for Reagan, Reagan Democrats. And the message of Reagan and the Republican Party was this: no more focusing on special interests. What or who are these special interests? The blacks, the Hispanics, the immigrants, gays and lesbians, feminists, the poor. It's a zero-sum game. If the Democrats support these special interests, they couldn't possibly support you. Throw in that these special interests are after your tax dollars. They're after your safety. They're after your religion. And they're even after your children. Tell people long enough that a win for the other is a loss for them long enough, and they will begin to believe it. After a while, add the labor unions. These are again special interests. Tell them that unions reward people for laziness. Tell them they should have the right to choose whether or not to join a union, pay union dues. No union shops. Unions are corrupt. So we'll protect you from these dirty unions by passing right-to-work laws. We won't mention that despite any corruption by unions, many of the gains workers enjoyed were in place due to unions. Employee benefits, pensions, safety regulations, 40-hour work weeks, overtime pay. But no, the unions are also special interests, just like the other special interests. So let's get rid of them too. Is it any wonder that union membership has been cut in half since 1983, and decline has been sharpest in the private sector, where these old manufacturing jobs, those jobs you could support your family with even if you did not have a college degree, came from? So with these messages winning the presidency consistently, and by a lot, remember, Reagan won overwhelmingly twice and nearly swept the Electoral College in 1984. How do you win back the White House if you're the Democratic Party? In a time of few ideas and convincing Republican rhetoric, if you can't beat them, join them. Enter the New Democrats, the Third Way, led by power couple Bill and Hillary Clinton. Bill Clinton, the Democratic governor of a southern state, and his equally ambitious attorney wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton, were ready and willing to take the bull by the horns and turn rightward. Out the gate, let's pick a fight with Sister Souljah to show that a new Democratic sheriff is in town and we are no longer for these special interests. Gays in the military? Nah. Try, don't ask, don't tell. And we have to protect the institution of marriage from gays too with the Defense of Marriage Act. Let's pass a crime bill, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes and you're out. Encourage private prisons and talk about bringing super predators to heel. Let's end welfare as we know it so we no longer support welfare queens, as Reagan liked to say. Let's support free trade with legislation like NAFTA, where 61% of the job losses in the United States due to NAFTA, according to the Economic Policy Institute, were manufacturing jobs, those well-paying union jobs. Those jobs going bye-bye had a huge effect on states like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Indiana. Those places sound familiar? And after their 8 years were done, the Clintons were not only entrenched in the Democratic Party establishment with an eye towards maintaining this third way, but were also entrenched in Wall Street. And after it was all said and done, the Republicans were still the party of big business, but the Democrats were no longer a haven for labor. And what happened to the base? What about the left? Well, they'll vote for Democrats anyway, so why bother to make the effort? The devil is in the details. Moving to the new center, just a smidge left of the right, is where we get our gains. Potstirrer Podcast will be back after this. Did you know? Is a short segment alerting you to a news story, government legislation, or other issue that may not make a lot of national headlines, but is important for you to know about and affects real people. Did you know for today's episode? In 2014, residents of Flint, Michigan were exposed to high levels of lead as their water source was switched from Lake Huron, treated by the Detroit Water and Sewer Department, to the Flint River and not properly treated in an effort to save money. A state of emergency was declared in 2016, and the water was not declared safe until 2017. Though the pipes that need to be replaced to completely fix the situation are still being replaced, and the project will likely not be completed before 2020. But did you know that the residents may have been exposed to more than lead? According to the Detroit Free Press and MLive Media, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found a link in February 2017 between a switch in water source and a spike in cases of Legionnaire's disease in Genesee County, the county where Flint is located, from June 2014 to November 2015. Usually rare, 87 cases were reported in this period, including 10 fatalities. State public health officials suspected a link between Flint River water and a Legionnaire's outbreak as early as 2014, but the information was not released to the public until early 2016. Now, back to Potstirrer Podcast.
I think, and I want to warn everybody, do not trust these numbers. I think the Trump vote is being, no, well, look, I'm in Michigan, so on the morning of the primary in March, all the polls, this network, all the networks.
Everybody missed Bernie.
Said that she was going to win that night by 8 to 25 points.
Right.
And of course, she lost 12 hours later. I think that there is so much despair in the state of Michigan, so much anger at the system. And when people hear Clinton, they hear Bush. And when they hear Bush, they hear Clinton. And it's Clinton, Bush, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Clinton, Clinton, Bush. That's been their life, and that's the system. And that's why he's been able to manipulate. And it's a con job to my friends and people I know in Michigan that are thinking of voting for him. And I am not sleeping, basically, because I'm spending my this week, last week in these Brexit states and talking to people in Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania.
It's interesting you're calling them Brexit states.
That's what they are. They're the Brexit states because it's the angry middle class, or used to be the middle class, and now they are people that work 2 jobs and are struggling to get by.
Michael Moore's message prior to the election was that Hillary Clinton was in danger of losing. The mainstream media laughed him off, thought he was just trying to motivate liberals to get out the vote in this sure-thing election. But what he said made sense to me at the time, and now it should make sense to you too. It's November 8th, 2016. It's the general election. Projections were just short of a slam dunk for Hillary Clinton, 90+% certainty. This DNC darling would surely become the first woman president. But then the polls rolled in, and many Americans on both the left and the right had the shock of their lives. And Hillary saw her dream of the presidency slip away. She won the popular vote, but we have never voted for president based on the popular vote. Presidential elections are all state by state, and with D.C., 51 mini-elections. and Hillary caught a huge L. November 8th, 2016 is a long-term consequence of the third way. The devil was coming for his due. In these Midwestern states, the places that lost so many of these manufacturing jobs and opportunities for sustaining a middle-class life, people in middle America were hurting, and the establishment, Democratic and Republican politicians alike, were not making their lives better. Under those circumstances, an outsider looks like an attractive option. Especially for poor and middle-class white Americans, someone who is speaking to their feelings can look very attractive. For working-class white Americans, the reason why they had been part of the Democratic Big Tent for so many decades is because of the party's support for labor. In moving so much further to the right, the Democratic Party lost the thing that set them apart and could unite poor, working, and middle-class Americans regardless of race, religion, gender, or most other identifiers. The Democratic Party lost their soul, and the Clinton signature was on the dotted line. Even with some states that usually vote blue in danger of being lost, Hillary decided to go to Arizona and Texas, states that had not voted for a Democrat in years, instead of making the effort to shore up her support in the states that were too close to call. And what about the base? What about the left? Remember, they'll vote for Democrats anyway, so why make the effort? But if you don't make the effort, enough of them may not vote for you that it can change the outcome. The base does not owe you their vote. You have to put in the work. In a lot of ways, Barack Obama governed from the center right, not that much different from the Clintons, very much third way. The Affordable Care Act was a rebranded version of Republican health care reform from a decade before, Romney Care. But as much as his political foes made fun of his years as a community organizer, Obama's community organizer experience made him an excellent campaigner. He out-fundraised a Wall Street-backed Hillary Clinton in 2008 and was able to keep his job against a well-heeled Mitt Romney in 2012. And a lot of that is because he and his people did their homework, and because they went to the right places and made the right appeals that felt genuine. But Hillary took the base for granted. Those ever-so-reliable blacks, Latinos, feminist white women, LGBT Americans, we're doing them a favor by giving them lip service and throwing them a bone every once in a while. Hillary Clinton initially distanced herself from much of the Democratic base until she realized too late that she actually needed them, and even then she was slow to address their concerns, instead resorting to shameless pandering.
I don't know who created Pokemon Go, but I'm trying to figure out how we get them to have Pokemon go to the polls.
What's something that you always carry with you?
Hot sauce.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Are you getting information right now? Hot sauce. Hot sauce in my bag, Swag?
Hot sauce.
Really?
Yes.
Now listen, I just want you to know, people are going to see this and say, okay, she's pandering to black people again.
Okay. Is it working?
You might wonder, why bring up November 8th, 2016? This was months ago. This is divisive. Left-leaning Americans are still arguing about this. Why not focus on opposing Trump's agenda instead? But I would say this. It is the truth. And the truth is not always pretty, but the truth will set you free. And we should never forget, if you feel the pain long enough, you will fight like hell to make sure you never have to feel it again. So what is the way forward? Folks, let's take ownership of our own country and hold our leaders' feet to the fire. Let's stop allowing ourselves to be sold out for the better of two evils, because the better of two evils is still evil, and that's how we got here. Make them earn their vote. Compromising what sets you apart is a long-term fail. The Democrats need to be a true opposition party and stop being afraid of being liberal. of being the left. We have a president with an R next to his name that embraces a Russia led by a former KGB man, and the left is un-American? Seriously? It is time to hold everyone to account, the Republicans and the Democrats. On my show, I will limit endorsing individuals or groups on the show because there's something to be said for being independent. If I remain independent, I'm free to support the people and groups I see doing the right thing and criticize when they go in the wrong direction. But I think one grassroots group that has the right idea is indivisible. They have a specific agenda. They are opposed to Donald Trump. Their strategy is to pressure both Republicans and Democrats. And they recognize that the letter next to a politician's name means almost nothing. And really, that's the takeaway. This country was built on blood, sweat, and tears of our forefathers. Those who have come before us have fought for the rights and liberties we have today, and the only way we continue to enjoy those rights and liberties as Americans and build upon them is to stay vigilant and continue to fight. Resist when they are being threatened. We can't expect ideological purity in our candidates. Most of us are not pure ourselves. But if the choices we face are terrible, raise up better choices and support them. The moment we give up, the politicians will too. Like Potstirrer Podcast on Facebook. Follow the show on Twitter at PotstirrerCast and Instagram at Potstirrer Podcast. I'm Jaye Pool. Let's fight for America's future because freedom is not free.